One of the experiences I trust every homebrewer shares is the feeling of awe that comes from witnessing the conversion of wort into beer through the fermentation process. Even after 15 years, I still get giddy when I see the first signs of airlock activity, a nice fluffy kreuzen developing on top of my beer. The worst is when this takes too long. You all know the anxiety that comes from checking on a batch a day after pitching and seeing no action. This is why we love Imperial Yeast, who pack 200 billion cells of the purest yeast into each pitch-right pouch, which assures quick starts, healthy fermentation, and predictably great results. I strongly urge all of our listeners to check out everything Imperial Yeast has to offer and let them know that you appreciate their support of the Brewlosophy podcast while you're at it. All right, on to the show. Brewers have quite a few things to pay attention to in making a batch of beer, all of which are believed to have some impact on the quality of the finished product. One of those things is mash pH, which in certain scenarios can fall outside of the ideal range, purportedly leading to various problems. When mash pH is too high, many brewers opt to reduce it by adding exogenous acids, though those who prefer using more natural ingredients have options as well. This is the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and joining me on this episode to discuss the use of Sauergut is contributor Cade Jobe.
Yeah, so Sauergut is used to adjust mash pH, and as I've said a bunch of times on the podcast, mash pH is, I guess it's a hangover for me, right? And I still check my mash pH, even though there's been a number of Brewlosophy experiments at both extremes, like low pH and really high pH, that didn't result in flavor differences. But, you know, I think it's just, I see the science behind it. There's a lot of literature out there on it, and this is a hangover for me. But, so I'm always interested in finding new ways to adjust mash pH and see if they are actually taste different, if they result in flavor differences. So I'm excited to see if Sauergut does that today.
Yeah, Sauergut. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, but I've made it clear a number of times in the past that water chemistry is something I take very, very seriously, based almost entirely on our personal experiments playing around with different water chemistries for different types of beers. Now, my focus has been largely on the mineral side of the water chemistry spectrum. And because, like you mentioned, Cade, because of the experiments that we've done showing that high and low mash pHs don't really seem to have too much of an impact, I've kind of stopped paying attention to that. But I know a lot of brewers out there still take it very seriously. And it's one of those things personally that I view as you're not going to hurt anything by minding your mash pH. So if it's something that you're interested in or you really believe is going to have an impact, then by all means do it. I don't think adjusting your mash pH to be within that ideal range again is going to hurt anything at all. So now I've never used Sauergut before to adjust my mash pH, but I know it's getting a lot more attention lately, and I look forward to chatting with you about it, Cade. If you like what we're up to and you want us to keep doing it, consider becoming a patron of Brewlosophy. By committing to a small monthly pledge over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy, you'll receive rewards like access to unpublished recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. Coming up later this month, May of 2022, Barry Chan from Seattle's Lucky Envelope Brewing will be taking questions from patrons. In addition to making all sorts of incredibly delicious beers, from light and crisp lagers to hopped up IPA and everything in between, Barry got his start as a homebrewer, meaning he knows all about the process of turning a hobby into a career. This is going to be a killer session that you do not want to miss. In order to be a part of it, you have to make your pledge at patreon.com/Brewlosophy by this Friday, May 20th, 2022, as Barry's going to be taking questions Saturday, May 21st. All past sessions are available on our private Facebook page, so you can go back and watch them whenever you like. And just a little tip, we're working on ways to upload those videos to our Patreon page so that patrons can watch them there instead of Facebook. Not done yet, but we're working on it. You can learn more about becoming a patron over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. And if you wouldn't mind letting us know what you think about this show by rating and reviewing it in Apple Podcasts or wherever it is you listen to podcasts that allows you to rate and review, we really would appreciate it. It only takes a few seconds of your time, and those reviews help make the show more visible to those who may not have heard it yet, while also providing us with valuable feedback that we use to make the show better. Thanks so much to everybody who's already taken the time to let us know what you think. All right, our first bit of feedback this week comes from listener Scott Steenberg, who wanted to share his method for transferring clear wort to the fermenter after hearing our response to a recent Brew&A question on the topic. Scott says, Though I think transferring crystal clear wort into the fermenter isn't really necessary, it sure does feel good to see a clean sample for the OG measurement. I brew on a 10.5 gallon Anvil Foundry system and use a jaded immersion chiller, so I too can't really whirlpool to get the trub into the center of the kettle. Here's what I do. First, I set my dip tube to the 2 o'clock position, just above parallel, and accept the fact that I'm going to lose a little over half a gallon of wort, which I account for when designing recipes. I chill as rapidly as possible. My jaded chiller does the trick, but I've found that small cold break particles will collect on the chilling coil, so I occasionally swirl the chiller not only to reduce chilling time, but to knock that particulate matter back into the wort. Once the wort's at 66 to 68 F, or right around 20 C, I remove the immersion chiller and cover the kettle with a sanitized lid. I then let the kettle sit for an hour, to allow for more cold break and particulate matter to settle. Then, before transferring to the fermenter, I pull off 2 to 3 cups of wort from the valve at the bottom of the kettle, which has the bulk of the trub in it, at which point I fill the fermenter. Now, Scott included a picture of a hydrometer sample to show how clear his wort gets, and it really is crystal clear. So
yeah, that's interesting. This whole clear wort thing. I would say, I don't really care if I get a lot of trub in my wort based on our experience, right? And you talked about that in that episode to that question. The only thing about clear wort I would say is that, well, I'd say a couple things, but one of them is, the nutrients that are in there are useful for yeast. So, if you notice that you're having stuck fermentations or under attenuation, it may be a good idea to get a little bit of trub in there. But in terms of your process, one thing that immediately came to mind is okay, if you're cooling down the wort and then you're letting it sit for an hour, you can take the immersion chiller out and whirlpool, right? And like take the immersion chiller out and put a paint stirrer on the end of a drill, sanitized, of course, and then whirlpool for 15 or 20 minutes, and then whirlpool your wort out that way, and maybe even get clearer. But yeah, I mean, that's still a really cool idea, innovative solution. And if clear wort is your thing, then yeah, go for it. I mean, it sounds like the pictures looked great too.
I mean, it's clear. It's very, very clear. Like you said, Cade, I think it's relatively well established these days that some aspects of kettle trub, is nutritious for yeast. And so transferring a little bit over, I've not experienced as being negative at all. Now, I did do an experiment where I transferred it all over and I compared it to another batch that didn't have any transferred over. And I tasted a difference. Most tasters, perceived a difference as well. They were able to tell those beers apart, and I did not like the high trub one. So for me, it's kind of this middle ground thing. I do like 20%, of what Scott does, which is I will, once I'm done chilling, I chill as rapidly as I possibly can. I'll let it sit for about 5 minutes, not an hour, just so that the big chunks of trub fall out, those lipids and the proteins and so a lot of the hot particulate and stuff. And then I'll gently rack off the bottom of my kettle. And, the wort, I would say, is kind of mostly clear, but it's not nearly as clear as Scott's. If you are going to rack that clear of wort over, it will serve you well to use a yeast nutrient. I've done this. I used to do basically what Scott does. I should have said that, where I just wanted the clearest wort in my fermenter. And there were so many times where I'd have a really long lag phase, or fermentation just would kind of putter out halfway through. And I'm convinced that is a lot of the reason why earlier on, 10 plus years ago, you'd see these people saying, I did everything right. I pitched the yeast. I made a starter, but it's stalling. It's not going. Put some yeast nutrient in there if you're not going to rack over any trub. So, all right, James Splinter was one of the many listeners who had feedback on the experience episode where we talked about naming beers. He said, great episode. I like Steve's idea of keeping a running note list on my phone. This will help me remember names that I come up with. I find that naming beers is a lot easier when you have kids running around. I have 2 boys, 5 and 7, and the things that come out of their mouths or what they do are a huge inspiration for me. My youngest was running around the house one day dressed as a ninja. His socks were only half on his feet and flopping around. I said, Marshall, what are you doing? And he said back, I'm a floppy sock ninja. So Floppy Sock Ninja Red IPA was born. Thanks for the laughs. Now, I just got to say that James was very clear to point out that his son's name actually is Marshall, which is really neat. I don't meet very many Marshalls, but that he also named him before he started listening to the podcast. So I was not, sadly, the inspiration for his son's name.
I love Floppy Sock Ninja.
It's awesome. Yeah, I love that.
That's a great beer name, man. I am so terrible at naming beers. It's not even funny. I'm I do a horrible job at it. Marshall names all of the beers for my experiments. So if you don't like those names on my experiments, you can blame Marshall for it. But don't give me any credit for it either. That's funny though. Floppy Sock Ninja. Maybe I need to start doing that too. That's a great idea, Steve. And James, to make a list of things that kids say and turn it into beer.
Oh, I've done it before many times. And I told the story about Tiny Bottom Pale Ale in that episode. That was inspired by, Roscoe, my son, my middle kid, coming out and brewing with me like 10 years ago and just kind of, turning the valves and doing his thing. And he's got a tiny little butt. So we called it Tiny Bottom. As your kids get older, Cade, I'm sure you will be inspired with your beer naming stuff. I was talking with somebody. Somebody emailed me after that episode and was like, "Man, I didn't realize you guys are publishing 2 articles a week, and in most of those articles, there's a new recipe that you guys name." And he was like, most people aren't naming that many beers, even professional breweries, they've got their lineup of go-tos, and those have a name and all of that, but they're not coming up with hundreds and hundreds of beer names, every couple of years. I thought, yeah, it does get difficult. You run out of content. So having kids can be very, very helpful, James. Thank you both for your feedback. If you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or drop us a note on social media. We will be right back with talk of Sauergut right after these messages. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com. And be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. Craftmaster Growlers takes traveling with and sharing beer to a new level. Made from heavy-duty stainless steel, Craftmaster Growlers are double-wall insulated and can keep beer cold for up to 8 hours. Unlike typical growlers, Craftmaster Growlers come with a swiveling tap and fully integrated CO2 regulator cap, allowing beer to stay fresh for 2 weeks or more. The square design takes up less space and will fit in most refrigerator doors, and every Craftmaster Growler comes with a 1-year warranty. There are 64 and 128-ounce versions available over at craftmastergrowlers.com. Mash pH is one of those things it seems brewers with a few moderately successful batches under their belt start to look into as a potential way to improve their beer. Once they conquer good sanitation, yeast pitch rates, fermentation temperature control, they start to question the old adage about water. If it's good enough to drink, it's good enough to brew with. This typically involves 2 primary things: mineral content and mash pH, the latter of which is believed to be very important for a number of reasons.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, mash pH is one of those things that there's a lot of science behind. Interestingly, the pH scale was actually invented at Carlsberg Brewery. I didn't know that until recently. Did you know that?
Drew Beecham told me that actually a long time ago.
Did he?
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. I didn't know that until like a month or so ago, but I was like, wow, that's amazing. We talk about pH and all this stuff in science, and it was a brewer that came up with it. But in any event, yeah, I mean, pH is one of those things. Like I said, it's got a lot of science behind it. That there are, that there's this sort of, I'm not going to call it magical, but there's this, nice range of pH where enzymes and temperature and all those things come together to create this awesome beverage that we like with beer, right? That maximizes that saccharification. And so pH, again, I mean, it can be super important, or at least from a scientific perspective. Now, is it important? I mean, I don't know. I think we can have some different opinions on that. that, but maybe that's better for an experience podcast and not for an experiment episode, right?
Yeah. Well, let's break down a little bit what pH is in general before we really start digging into mash pH. It's a pretty basic idea, right? Hey, I did not mean to use that term as a pun. It is a pretty simple concept. You've got this scale 0 to 14 where 7 is neutral, and anything below 7 is considered acidic, and the lower that number goes, the more acidic a solution is, and anything over 7 is basic, and the higher that number goes, the more basic it is. Up to like bleach, right? You got bleach, chlorine and stuff are your basics. Solutions, you've got acids, exogenous acids, lactic acid, phosphoric acid on the acidic side. And the idea when it comes to the mash is that when the mash rest occurs, right, in this ideal range, which, correct me if I'm wrong, Cade, I haven't adjusted my mash pH in a while, but I think if you were to say that the ideal pH number would be 5.2, but I think the range people give is about 5.2 to 5.6.
Yeah, exactly. Right. 5.2 to 5.6 of room temperature wort. That's
right.
Also a key there whenever you're talking about pH. pH is dependent on temperature a little bit. So room temperature wort, 5.2 to 5.6. So not 150 degree wort that you're pulling, or 65 C wort that you're pulling out of your mash tun. But yeah, so like you said, it's the scale of acidity, right? But there's a lot of things that happen with pH. So pH is well known in a lot of food systems to have this impact on the mash, on how well you get sugars or starches converted to fermentable sugars. So there's like I said, there's a lot of research out there that shows that if you have this ideal range, right, of 5.2 to 5.6 in beer, that you're going to get the most extraction out of those sugars, or at least that's the ideal characteristic. Now, we've mentioned it on prior shows before, but this whole concept of ideal is sort of squishy, right? Because
Sure
enzymes work outside of 5.2 to 5.6, so you can brew beer at 6, or maybe even 7, although I've never done that, or maybe down as low as 3. I have done that, right? A sour beer, you can you can still extract sugars even at those lower temperatures, but things change, right? The system itself changes. So there's costs and benefits of too high, too low. Most of it, though, is just going to be really on mouthfeel, right? Or the purported sourness of the beer, right? The purported acidity of the beer, and that's kind of that's one of the things that I've sort of, like I said, this is my hangover, and one of the reasons why I still pay attention to pH. I guess I'm not as worried about the saccharification, the amount of sugars I'm going to get out, but I am worried about where that beer is going to end up in terms of pH and mouthfeel and flavor, because there's a lot of difference. Anybody that's had a sour beer knows that tastes different than a porter or a stout that's nice and smooth and creamy.
Yeah, it's interesting when talking about pH. I think the first place, particularly more novice brewers might go, is thinking about the perceptible impact it has, right? Because we expect acid to be sour, an acidic solution to be more sour or tart, whereas a basic one might be a little bit more fuzzy. It might do other things. Now, there are certain things that aren't necessarily... It's kind of difficult for me to talk about because I feel like when we're talking about mash pH, the main focus with mash pH in particular isn't necessarily that perceptible component. Now, maybe that's kind of downstream consequence, but it really is about conversion and the way that mash, the enzymes are going to work on those grains, right? There are some things with mash pH that you might hear in regards to high mash pH. For example, a higher or a more basic mash is purported to extract more tannins from grain husks, right? So you might expect to get, again, downstream in the finished beer, you might expect to get a more astringency in a beer that was mashed with too high of a pH. In a beer that's mashed with too low of a pH, one of the things that I heard about, at least, and maybe I'm off on this, was that you're going to get poor extraction. So you might not get as good a conversion of those starches into fermentable sugars. So your OG is going to end up a little bit lower. And maybe again, downstream, the other consequence of that is that maybe the beer is going to be a little bit more tart. Now, the thing about grains is they are incredible buffers. They have this really good capacity to bring that pH very, very close to the ideal range, regardless of the starting pH of the water. You have to consider, I think the average, I was looking this up years ago, so maybe it's changed, but the average pH of drinking water is like 8.0. So it's more basic than anything. It's not very low. It's not acidic at all.
Yeah, exactly. When you start thinking about some of those places like Burton-on-Trent, or some of the places that have limestone that in their groundwater, right? If you're brewing from groundwater, I've brewed with beer that was a pH of around 9. I brewed beer with water that was a pH of around 9. And yeah, that buffering capacity is huge, right? I mean, there's a whole bunch of pH active substances that adjust that pH to get into that right range.
Yeah.
And that pH is kind of important for a lot of things. It's important for a lot of cells, right? I mean, plant cells, especially, I guess is what we're talking about here. It's also important for yeast in fermentation. Now, again, we're not trying to acidify the wort to deal with yeast and fermentation here. We're trying to get access to those sugars. And like you said, there's costs and benefits going all the way up and down the scale. But to me, one of the good takeaways here, again, is that the malt itself is going to have a whole bunch of, like I said, pH active substances that are going to adjust things for you and keep you within pretty close to that ideal range. But there are things you can do to adjust mash pH, right? And so a lot of emphasis and a lot of research has been put onto what can you use to adjust mash pH, and even why should you, right?
Yeah.
So again, you can add a substance like a pure acid itself, or you can add Sauergut or acidulated malts, and we'll talk about those in a little bit. But the whole point is trying to get the pH to help the buffering system do its job, right? If you start with super high or super low, that's the whole point, is to help the buffer get into that ideal range to have maximum saccharification.
Exactly. And in what situations might brewers who are concerned with mash pH, to qualify that, in what situations are they going to be adjusting the pH of their mash? Typically what you're looking at is in very, very pale beers. So let's say Pilsner that's made with 100%, 1.8 Lovibond Pils malt, you run the risk of having too basic of a mash there. So the mash pH might be up above that 5.6. There are people out there who swear that they can taste a difference. Now, I doubt they've put it to the test, but in their head, anecdotally, they can taste the difference between a Pilsner that had a mash pH of 5.6 and one that had a mash pH of 5.2. I've never been able to. I can't taste that difference. But that is a situation that the paler the malts, the paler the beer, the more likely you are to have a more basic mash. Whereas on the other end, the darker the beer, let's say you're making a big old imperial stout with a whole bunch of roasted grains, roasted barley, black malt, whatever it might be, those are acidic grains. And so you add those to the entire mash, and you are very likely going to fall below that 5.2, depending on your starting water, that 5.2 pH mark on the other end of the scale of that ideal range. And so in those scenarios, you might be looking for something. What can I do? What can I add to this mash to get that pH where I want it to be? Obviously, if you're doing a dark beer that's falling too low, you're going to have to add something basic. I've used pickling lime. I've used baking soda. You got to be careful with both of those because they can have an impact in other areas on your brewing. People use chalk. I know that there's some talk out there about how chalk doesn't dissolve very well. I always had success with chalk. I never had it not dissolve, at least that I could tell, and it always brought the pH up to where I wanted it to be. But there are those options. What our focus is in this show, though, is bringing that is acidifying the mash to bring the pH down. So we're talking about more pale beers in this episode, particularly because that's kind of where you're going to need to reduce the pH. And for that, in doing that, I think some of the most popular sources of acid are exogenous, things like 88% lactic acid, 10% phosphoric acid. You can use citric acid. I'm sure there are other acids out there people use. Cade, you mentioned acidulated malt. I believe these days most acidulated malts are just, pale malt that's sprayed with lactic acid. I heard that from somebody. I could be wrong on that. But all of those are intended, again, to reduce the pH into that range. And then there are the folks who are very, very concerned with not adding anything, outside of the Reinheitsgebot, which I'll let you take us down that path, Cade.
Yeah. But before we get to the Reinheitsgebot, I do want to sort of pop back up for just a minute about like adjusting, pH. You mentioned that not tasting a difference between a beer that's brewed with a mash pH of 5.2 versus 5.6, and I would say that's kind of the right range, right? I mean, that's the ideal range, and maybe that's one of the reasons why it's the ideal range. But you will notice, and I notice this whenever I brew, if you start with the mash pH of 5.2, the final pH of your beer is also going to be lower. So even though you've got this buffering system, you're sort of putting your thumb on the scale whenever you're brewing at that lower range, and that's part of what we're trying to do in adjusting pH, is put our thumb on the scale to make the beer taste like we want, to have the extraction efficiency that we want, and to have the consistency between batches. So I just wanted to sort of make that comment. I think you touched on all those things, but I wanted to sort of mention that. But yeah, so you talked about exogenous acids, which is just lactic phosphoric citrus, and then you mentioned acidulated malt. Well, acidulated malt, like you said, can be just a pale malt with lactic acid sprayed on top of it, or lactic sprayed on top of it. But traditionally, acidulated malt was produced during the germination step of malting, you allow the lactic acid bacteria that's on the malt itself to just undergo this lactic acid fermentation. So it's anaerobic conditions. There's not exposure to oxygen, even though that's not really a big deal for the lactic acid bacteria, or at least most of them that are present on malt. But you let them undergo this lactic acid fermentation, and it creates this sour flavor of malt. All right, and you can add acidulated malt along with your regular mash, and that reduces that pH. Now, this was really important for German brewers, right? I mean, German brewers are generally brewing pale lagers, or at least that's kind of their bread and butter, even though they have a bunch of other beers to brew. That sort of came about that way. And if you look at, historically, you can't talk about acidulated malt, or let me wait on the Reinheitsgebot for just a minute, because I'm almost there. So acidulated malt, if you just brewed with it, right? If you just put 100% acidulated malt and took the wort out of that wort is going to be sour. It's going to be a lower pH than a normal wort would be, because you've put a bunch of lactic acid in there. You've put your thumb way on the scale. That wort is Sauergut, sour wort. So that is what we're talking about today, is essentially the liquid, the wort that comes off of a sour mash. And so that's really all we're doing in this episode, is adding, or what we're talking about in this episode is adding this sour wort to control mash pH. So instead of acidulated malt, or instead of exogenous enzymes, you just have some sour wort sitting around, and you dump that in to adjust the pH. Now, where did this all come from? It all came from the Reinheitsgebot, and that's where Marshall originally was leading me down the path. So I'll answer that real quick too. I mean, we've all talked about we all know the Reinheitsgebot. It's this German purity law that says that beer can only be malt, hops, water, and then later yeast, right? And one thing I want to mention about the German purity law, because I think this is important when we talk about Sauergut, is that it didn't come about because of preserving like the superiority or the higher quality of German beer. Okay?
That's just what it turned into.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's what it turned into. All it was a taxation law, essentially, and a requirement. So it set the price for beer so that they could have the right taxes paid. It said that you can't use wheat because the bakers were pissed that brewers were using wheat. And hey, people need to eat, right? Not just drink beer all the time. And then the other thing it did is said that brewers can't adulterate their beer, right? So the brewers were putting a lot of nasty crap in their beer, like pitch, which is poisonous. So they just said, hey, don't stop doing that. It's kind of meant it, but like you mentioned, Marshall, it's kind of grown into this thing of like, the preservation of German brewing conditions, sort of like cask ale or Camera in the UK. And I mention that because why we would want to use Sauergut, right? And so I think a lot of people that are using Sauergut are using it because of German purity law. Same reason why you would want to use acidulated malt. It's natural, it's present on the malt. You don't violate any laws, you're not adding any exogenous enzymes. And sort of that's why I think Sauergut has sort of become popular. But there's a segment of people that have started to say, oh, well, Sauergut is what causes this German it factor. Right, so that's what makes German beers great, is because they're brewing with this Sauergut, this sour malt, and that's an interesting part of what the experiment that we designed and the ultimate result that happened.
Yeah. So the thing about Sauergut that I find interesting is that it really. So if you look up a definition, I think it'll be something like this. It'll be a low gravity unhopped wort that is soured. Now you mentioned it could just be acid malt wort. My understanding was that a typical Sauergut is just unhopped, real low gravity, like 1030 OG wort that is then soured with a lactobacillus culture. So it's funny to me because if that's what you're doing to make your Sauergut, then you can just use the lactobacillus culture in your mash anyways, right? Yeah. But whatever, it gets soured to below 3.5 pH, and then that gets added to your mash in the same way that you might add, lactic acid or phosphoric acid or whatever. The thing is that at 3.5 pH, you have to use quite a bit more in total volume than you would an exogenous acid. So it makes sense to me that it could potentially have more of a flavor, like a perceptible flavor impact than the lactic acid. And also I've heard many times now, I believe we've talked about this in the past on the show, that the process for making lactic acid can create this kind of remnant buttery characteristic in that lactic acid. So a lot of people want to avoid that. You don't get it in Sauergut. You get this kind of interesting sour beer that you get to add back to the mash rather than going and getting this sciencey lactic acid stuff.
Yeah. So starting from the sciencey lactic acid stuff, but there's a couple parts here, right? One of the things that you mentioned is this concentration, right? So when we're talking about Sauergut, we're talking about like 180 to 200 mils in like a 20 liter 5 gallon batch, which is actually less than 1% of the total volume, right? So it's still a very, very small amount. But then compare that to lactic acid itself, like exogenous acids. That's like 9 or 10 mils in a 20 liter batch, depending on the concentration, right? But so that's like 0.045%, which is like super low. So I can certainly see, there's a little bit of maybe a flavor change when you're adding something at, like 180 or 200 mils, but still that's a really, really small amount. And again, the whole point of this isn't to change the flavor of the beer, or at least that's what mash pH adjustment historically has been. The whole point is to adjust the pH into this ideal range. So I always kind of saw that was people saying like, oh yeah, Sauergut, this is the German it factor. And I kind of looked at that and I kind of went, I don't really know, right? I mean, that all we're doing is adjusting match pH. We don't want it to have a flavor impact. Yeah. So if it does have a flavor impact, isn't that a bad thing? And that's kind of how I was, looking at it first. But you did mention the definition also of Sauergut is this low gravity unhopped wort that's cultured with lactobacillus. And while that is true in some manufacturing applications, it depends too, right? That wouldn't probably fly with Reinheitsgebot. So if you're getting it from a German manufacturer like Weyermann, if they're doing that, hopefully they're not saying it's Reinheitsgebot, usable. But anytime there are lactic acid bacteria that are present on the malt, and yes, they survive the malt process, right? Or that are present on the barley, they survive the malt process, and you can make sour mash beers, right? People have been doing it for hundreds of years, just using the microorganisms that are present on the malt to acidify a mash. And again, all you're talking about here, instead of taking that malt then and drying it to make acidulated malt, you're just running the wort off, and that wort is sour, right? So it's going to be a pH of well below 3.5. Right. And so finding out the amount to adjust there to get it right, it's sort of this really natural flow. I can certainly see brewers like iterating this over a number of years, right? Where it's not just like, oh, we now have access to purified lactic acid. No, I have this beer that I let, sit and steep, and it's really tart, but whenever I blend it with this other beer that's really sweet, it tastes good, right? And it makes great things happen for me.
Yeah, exactly. Now, there are ways that people can make Sauergut at home. We're not going to get into those methods. You can just Google it and you'll find multiple approaches to doing that. Well, like I mentioned earlier, I didn't focus too much, or I don't these days focus too much on mash pH, which I'll admit has influenced, was influenced by a couple past experiments. Like I mentioned earlier, we've been able to show that too low, too high doesn't seem to have much of a perceptible impact. And on my scale, my 5-gallon batch scale, I don't really care if I lose a couple, a little bit of conversion or, a couple OG points here or there. I can just adjust for it knowing my system. Still, I know that mash pH is something a lot of brewers view as being really important, and I understand why. So curious of how Sauergut compares to other forms of acid, Cade. You put it to the test. We're going to be going over the details and results of that experiment when we're back from this break. There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. Have you ever thought about adding a port to your kettle but held off because you didn't feel like drilling into your gear or sending it off to have someone else do it? From the makers of the world's fastest counterflow chiller, the Xchillerator, comes the Hangover, the easiest way to add extra ports to your kettle as well as countless other options. Mount a faucet to your keg for easy portable pouring. Set up the perfect whirlpool arm. Hold a heating element in place. All of this and so much more without permanently modifying your gear. Manufactured right here in the United States, the Hangover offers brewers too many convenient solutions to list here. So head over to xchillerator.com today to see what the Hangover can do for you. I think it took me a good 2 years of brewing before I even started thinking about water chemistry, and then when I did, I went all in. While I tried a couple different ways to reduce my mash pH, I ultimately settled on 88% lactic acid because it's really cheap, and you really don't need to use that much. However, this isn't feasible for those who prefer using more natural ingredients, so another option is Sauergut, which some believe does more than just reduce mash pH. Cade, you were curious to see for yourself, and you put it to the test.
Yeah, I was curious to see about Sauergut, and one of the reasons was because I'd done this experiment, lactic versus phosphoric, and that one came back as significant in the time that I did it, but not in the time in a prior experiment. So there may be something behind this. The type of acid that you use to adjust mash pH might have some impact, and that's kind of what in discussing this with some other brewers, that's kind of where I wanted to take this. Is like, okay, let's see if I can acidify the mash to the same pH, but if using a different acid source makes a difference. So I'm going to use Sauergut versus pure lactic acid, but we'll get to that in a second. So it started off like any other batch of Kolsch, which is the style that I chose for this. I made dual 5-gallon batches in my Brow Supply units using my standard Kolsch base malt bill, which is 95% Pilsner malt and 5% wheat malt. In this one, I used white wheat instead of red wheat, and I think I like the red wheat better, but that's for later. But any event, so brewing process is very typical. Mashed both at 152 Fahrenheit, 67 Celsius for 60 minutes. But that mash is where I added the variable. So I added 180 mils of Sauergut to one mash. And then the other one got 9.5 mils of 88% lactic acid. And mash pH measured at 15 minutes was for the Sauergut 5.42 pH and lactic 5.40 pH, which is pretty darn close.
I mean, it seems close enough to me. I know that, what do they say? That pH is logarithmic, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And so small changes can actually be quite drastic, but 0.02 difference in pH, to me, that shows that you just did a really good job on your measuring in terms of your predicted or expected pH based on the additions that you made. So good job there, Cade.
Well, thank you. And I guess that should be mentioned too. So the Sauerwort that I was using was from Weyermann's. It was given to me by Jordan Folks and Russell Berger from Portland Brewers Collective. And it's so Sauergut at Wireman's is actually just 5.5% lactic acid. So you can just use that calculation instead of 88% lactic acid, and plug that into whatever calculator you're using for acid adjustments. So that was a really simple and easy to use ingredient. So that's why I hit those better. But like we talked about earlier, 180 mils of Sauergut versus 9.5 mils of lactic acid. Even though that's the same quantity of lactic acid, there are other things in there, and so it's interesting to see if that has a flavor difference.
Absolutely.
Well, the rest of the brew day was standard. So mashes were when the mashes were complete, I took the grains out and boiled for 60 minutes, added 40 grams of Tettnang at 60 minutes and 30 grams of Tettnang at 5 minutes. Then when the boils were complete, the worts were chilled before identical volumes were racked to separate fermenters. OG was right where I wanted it. So the Sauergut OG was 1046 OG, but the lactic acid one was actually a little bit lower, so 1045 OG.
So when I see that kind of a difference, a one specific gravity point difference, which I mean that is so tiny, it could be a function of so many different things, just process, boil vigor differences, even slight. Because of how controlled I know you are, Cade, I do have a tendency to think that difference is probably because of the addition of the Sauergut, but maybe not. Either way, I don't think it's big enough to be too concerning in this case.
Yeah, well, and so I did the math on this, and so if we assume that the Sauergut was at 1035 or 1040 OG, Wireman doesn't publish that, so I just kind of have to assume that that's what it's at, because that's kind of a normal, wort extract OG. But if you assume it's at 1030 OG, the Sauergut at 180 mils would only adjust the sugar content around 1/3 of an SG point. Okay. So that's 1/3 of an SG point. We're not even talking about degrees Plato, which is what most brewers are looking at. So it's such a small amount that it might have adjusted that. The only thing I can think of is it just hit the right spot to raise it just enough that we saw a difference in the hydrometer, or maybe there's something else that's going on in there. Maybe there's some additional nutrients or some additional enzymes that are present in the Sauergut that help with extract efficiency. I have no idea, but that's all I can think about. But either way, 1 OG point, I'm not going to be too upset about.
Not at all.
That difference. So then I pitched a pouch of Imperial Yeast's GO3 Dieter into each fermentation chamber.
Awesome
and then
yeast.
Let them...
We love that yeast so much. Yeah, it's so good.
I love Dieter. Yeah, that's a great one, especially for Kolsch. I mean, that's the Kolsch yeast. In my opinion, I like to ferment that one sort of on the cooler side. But any event, in this one, I did that, right? I fermented it at 54 Celsius for about 3 days, and then raised it to 64 Celsius.
54 Fahrenheit and 64 Fahrenheit.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah.
54 Fahrenheit, 12 Celsius, and then raised it to 64 Fahrenheit, 18 Celsius, but then only left it for another 4 or 5 days until hydrometer measurements showed that both batches had reached their final gravity. So Sauergut was around 1010 final gravity, and lactic was 1008 final gravity. So that difference increased by a point.
Yeah. Now, this again, Sauergut starts 1 point higher, finishes 2 points higher. Lactic acid starts at 1045, finishes at 1008. Again, I'm not too concerned about this. I think that's maybe like a 0.2% ABV difference. Nothing to be too concerned about again. But it is interesting to note. It's an observed difference, and given the controls that you put in place, one could presume at the very least that the difference in acidification, source, I guess. Is what caused these differences in specific gravity. So just kind of something to put in the back of the mind,
Yeah, I mean, that's all we can figure out. I can't think of another way to rationalize that. But again, I'm not sure that 2 gravity points is going to make a whole lot of a difference in the end of the beer. But in any event, so the beers were pressure transferred into CO2 purged kegs that were placed on gas in my Keyser. I did my traditional overnight burst carbonation process, then reduced the gas to serving pressure, and the beers were allowed to condition for a couple of weeks before they were ready for evaluation. And much to my chagrin, I didn't actually get to serve these to the Portland Brewers Collective. I had to use some friends here in Corvallis and around for that. But in any event, they conditioned for a couple weeks before they were evaluated.
Now, when you started, we like to let the beers sit for at least a week before we start serving them to tasters. And this was post-COVID lockdown stuff, so we did serve these to tasters. But before you did that, you evaluated them yourself, and we got pictures. You can go look at the picture of the finished beer. To my eyes, based on the photo that's in the article, those beers look identical to me. There's no difference. Now, maybe you saw something in real life that it's hard to kind of convey in an image, Cade?
No. I mean, the beers were similar in color, clarity, foam, everything was similar. They looked identical to me, so nothing there in terms of appearance.
Now, so you did a series of 5 semi-blind triangle tests. By semi-blind, we're just saying you knew the variable, but you did your best to serve yourself these triangles in a way where you didn't know what beer was what. We do that by using 4 cups of the same color. 2 of the cups are marked on the bottom. The other 2 aren't. The ones that are marked get the same beer. The ones that aren't get the same beer. And then we randomly select 3, usually with a helper. We select 3 of those and do a series of triangle tests. Out of the 5 that you did, how many did you get right?
Well, so surprisingly, I got 4 of the 5 right. And I say surprisingly because both of those beers were really good. I loved those. After that 2 weeks, I think they were gone within about 3 weeks or 4 weeks. So, I mean, people were crushing them, and I was too. They were really good, both versions. But there was definitely a difference, at least to my palate. The Sauergut beer was clean and fresh and crisp. And that's not to say that the other one wasn't. It's just it was cleaner and fresher and crisper. I mean, it just popped a little bit more, if that's it. Like my wife likes to say upness, right? I've talked about it on the podcast before. It just had more upness than the other beer. And again, that's not to say that the other beer was bad. The other beer was definitely tasty, but man, that Sauergut beer, it tasted better and I liked it. I liked it better than the other one.
I'll tell you, when you told me about these tests, I think you were surprised. I did not expect you or anybody to be able to tell these beers apart. I just figured lactic acid is lactic acid is lactic acid. Sure, You're adding a little bit more Sauergut because, but it's basically just wort. You're already making wort anyways. Not a big deal. They're going to be the same. But in your personal experience, you could easily tell them apart. Now, you didn't get 5 out of 5, so one could question, that level of consistency. But not only did you get 4 out of 5 triangle tests right, but you preferred the Sauergut beer slightly at the very least, and I trust that both were really good. I just thought that was fascinating, but I was even more interested after your experience to see how blind tasters would do.
Yeah, so I served it to 21 participants, which at that level means that we would need to see 12 participants get it correct in order for there to be a significant result. And that's actually how many we saw. So it was 12 participants, 57% got it right. I got 4 out of 5, 80%, which I'm not like tooting my own horn or anything. I'm just saying maybe I got lucky. But 57% got it right with the tasters. And so people were able to reliably tell the beers apart. But interestingly, the preference data was flipped. So only 4 people liked the beer with Sauergut versus 8 liked the one made with lactic acid more, which was flipped from my perception, which I think is so funny.
Yeah, and just to be clear, it's not that they didn't like the other one. They preferred 4 people preferred the Sauergut beer over the lactic acid one. 8 preferred the lactic acid over the Sauergut. Interestingly, nobody put the other options, which were we allow them to admit that they really didn't perceive much of a difference between them, but also where they don't have a preference despite having perceived a difference. Nobody picked either of those. So it does seem like people were more confident in their preference selection, and that, double the amount of people who liked the Sauergut beer preferred the lactic acid one more. That's fascinating to me. And what it says to me is, okay, Sauergut may very well have a more than just a, objective kind of impact on during the mash in terms of conversion. It may actually affect the way that beer is perceived in the end. And this data backs that up. Now, is that the quote it factor? Who knows? You liked it more. I'm so curious if I would have liked which one I would have liked more now, because I've never made a beer with Sauergut. And as far as I know, I don't know if unless, German, corporate breweries are using Sauergut. I don't know if I've ever even had a beer made with Sauergut. So.
Right. Well, and Sauergut is kind of hard to source in the United States. I mean, you can get it from Wireman's and you can get it shipped to you, but at least from homebrewers, that's going to be shipped to you in like a 20 kilo box. so you're going to have enough Sauergut for like 10 years unless you're splitting it with somebody. So it's a little bit difficult to source. And again, that's where I got it from Jordan Folks and Russell Berger from Portland Brewers Collective. So that's how I had access to it. But yeah, I mean, and the other thing I can say about the preference data and the significance is maybe it's going to taste different to different people. And, I've had a couple of other examples. Both Jordan and Russell also brewed with this beer. So I've had some of their beers. I don't think they'll get mad at me for talking about them on the show. But I've had both of their beers. They're both phenomenal brewers, and their beers taste great. They taste fantastic. But the last time I was there at a Portland Brewers Collective meeting, we talked about how Russell and Jordan have both identified what they call Sauergut flavor. So they're able now to like pick out at least a light lager that's brewed with Sauergut. And I was anosmic to it, right? Like I was like, maybe I just haven't brewed enough with Sauergut, but I just couldn't taste a Sauergut flavor, even though I noticed that the beers were cleaner, fresher, and more crisp. So, it's kind of interesting. So I'm wondering too if, different beers brewed with Sauergut might have different flavors. And then the other thing they're doing is they're adding it both at the boil and during the mash to adjust pH. So that might also have a little bit of a flavor difference. But me having tasted their beers, I'm not sure I could I could notice a difference. But it was a really fascinating and interesting conversation based on these results and their own brewing experiences with Sauergut.
Yeah, definitely. And Jordan is a phenomenal brewer. I've had a couple of beers that he's made and sent to me, and boy, oh boy, I wish I could brew that good. One was a brewed IPA that I was just floored with how delicious it was. So, well, yeah, so those are, Sauergut is one of those things that I doubt. People often ask, did this experiment, influence the way you brew? I doubt I'm ever going to make this stuff. It just sounds too complicated to make on my own. And since it is more difficult to source, and I've got a ton of lactic acid, which costs like $4, for a year's supply, that's likely what I would stick to. But again, I don't really adjust my mash pH anyways. So this isn't one of those experiments that's going to have much of an impact, but I would love to try a Kolsch or a Pilsner or something like that, real nice pale beer that was made with Sauergut and compare it with one made with a different acid. I want to see if which one I actually like more, because I might go back to adjusting my mash pH with Sauergut, even if it has this what I perceive to be a qualitatively good impact on the finished product.
Yeah, and that's something I'm sort of more interested in thinking about in the future is the different lactic or different acidification methods, right? Phosphoric versus lactic versus Sauergut versus acidulated malt.
Yeah.
Because I wonder if, like you mentioned, lactic acid is lactic acid is lactic acid, but maybe it's not, right? Maybe there is something else that's going on in there. There's just because of the medium that you're using for lactic acid, maybe there's some difference there. And that's something I'd be really interested in exploring in the future.
Absolutely. I thought just a fascinating experiment, in my opinion. Now, we do have some reader comments to get to. Just a couple. First one comes from Gene Jockey, who says, Sauergut isn't necessarily, quote, more natural than lactic acid. Industrially, the latter is generally made via fermentation. Sure, it's done in a large-scale reactor, but that's just as natural as your brewing process. I don't mean to nitpick, but appeal to nature is pretty much my favorite logical fallacy. If one wants to follow historic practices in brewing, no issue there. It's a brewing choice just like any other.
Yeah, so much here. And I won't get off too in the weeds on this. But yeah, I mean, we talked about the Reinheitsgebot, right? And how that was sort of maybe a driver of Sauergut and its use. And like historical iteration of brewing practice. But having done this now and having used Sauergut, I might consider using it in my brewing practices in the future. Now, the appeal to nature being a logical fallacy. I mean, yes, I think there's questions about at what point you talk about something being, quote, natural versus, not natural, right? And there's all kinds of debates over that I'm not going to wage into on, in answering a question there. But I do think, even though lactic acid is produced in a bioreactor and made via fermentation, it's still got extraction and it's still going to go through purification and all sorts of processes that are additional to just letting bacteria that's on the malt or on the malted barley grow.
Yeah.
So I think you're certainly going to have some arguments about that, and I can certainly understand people's position on that. But yeah, I mean, I liked what the beer came out as when I used Sauergut in this Kolsch, so maybe there is something to this.
Yeah, I love what Gene said here, that, we're constantly looking, or some people are constantly looking for, reasons to make a change in their brewing process that maybe is an appeal to nature or an appeal to authority or whatever. Just do what you want to do. Do what works. All of that stuff, fine, whatever. But don't try to write it off as something more serious than it has to be. Final comment comes from Brian Walters on Facebook, who says, "This is interesting considering they're both forms of lactic acid. You use 9.5 milliliter of lactic, though I figured that's around 1.25 milliliters per gallon for the batch, and that's a lot. I've just started using it myself and started cold crashing a Kolsch today that I used 0.75 milliliters per gallon in. The Sauergut seems like it might be a difficult solution to a minor problem unless you just want to stick with that tradition."
Yeah, or unless there's a flavor component to it,
exactly.
Right? I mean, if there's a flavor component and I like the Sauergut flavor better, or I like that my beer is cleaner, fresher, and crisper, that's a part of it, right? And if I can use Sauergut to make my beer better, then I might do that. Regarding the level of lactic acid, yeah, I brew with hard water, right? I mean, I'm on groundwater on a well here in Corvallis, so it's coming up through whatever minerals are getting picked up on the way down to the water table, and then coming up through my well. So it's super hard, and I have to add a lot of lactic acid. Same whenever I was brewing in Austin, Texas, with the limestone filtered water. I mean, it just depends on the water that you use, right? I mean, you in terms of the amount of lactic acid that you have to add, and the grains and all the other things, to get to that pH level. But I always caution people whenever they talk about adding lactic acid at 1 or half a milliliter per gallon, or 1 milliliter per gallon, or 10 milliliters per gallon. It's all going to depend on a whole bunch of other factors. So don't get stuck too much on, just the rate of addition, because other things are going to impact that. Your underlying water chemistry, the malts that you're using, and then any other additions and nutrients that you're adding.
Exactly. I've mentioned before how maybe a couple months out of every year we switch to a different water source at my house while they do updates on our plant, and my water gets super hard. And back when I was adjusting my mash pH, it would require, I think the most I ever used was 12 milliliters of 80% or 88% lactic acid, which seemed like a ton, and my mash pH was 5.2. So it just, again, it's very subjective based on your starting water. So, well, that is all we've got on brewing with Sauergut. Don't forget to subscribe to the Brew Lab, where Cade takes you into the lab with brewing experts to discuss the fascinating work they've done on our favorite beverage. And as always, you can read more about the experiment we discussed by clicking the link to the article at brewlosophy.com in the description of this episode. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it soothes my throat. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more.